All right, so before moving on to adding in the ceiling, I want to talk about decals because decals are a thing specific to Unreal that will really start to elevate your workflow, and it's something that you don't have access to in other render engines. So you can find these by going to the globe icon in Quixel Bridge and going to decals. And let's go down to leakage decals. Now, these are really quick ways to add grime and detail to your scenes without having to texture anything by hand. These are drag and drop materials that you can pop onto your scene and across several objects at a time. And if you use them the right way, they can really elevate boring standard scenes into something pretty special. So let's grab a couple here. The best way to keep our scene optimized is with the same idea is instancing our materials, but it will be by using just a few decals the right way. So I want to make sure to switch from high quality back to medium quality before downloading these because we're not going to see them up close. And we want to find decals that look very different from one another. So that way we have 3 or 4 unique decals that we can move around our scene, rotate them, scale them around, change them, and instance them in the same way that we're going to instance materials by just making slight modifications to the same few, but we're only going to load in a couple textures as opposed to 20 different original textures, which again will start to fill up our texture memory really, really fast. And so now we have a new decals folder in our content browser with the 4 that we've selected. And let's start to just drag these into our scene and see what they look like. If I haven't mentioned it already, if you press G, that'll swap into game mode, which is what you'll see inside of your game. It basically removes any bounding boxes or any icons that are associated with widgets, but sometimes you want to see those so that you can align them. Decals by default are brought in with X facing downwards. So if you see here, this blue arrow, that's the direction that this decal is going to project from. So if I rotate this towards our wall by 90 degrees, you'll see that now it's projecting correctly. And let's just scale this down to something a bit smaller. And you can see these need to cover whatever they're projecting onto. So this really thin green bounding box needs to be intersecting with this geometry. And you can see from here that it looks like this decal is upside down. So we'll want to rotate this 180 degrees. And there we go. So we'll thin this out just a little bit. So cool, there's our first one. And we'll just add in the rest of them so we can start to see exactly what they look like. One thing you can do too is if you just duplicate this over here, you can go to our next one and just drag in the new material. And this one we can scale out in X because it's a different resolution. And there we go. There are 4 different decals that all kind of come in at different sizes and shapes. And now we can just take these, and as long as we only bring in a couple different materials and limit the amount of textures that we're bringing in, now it's very quick to start populating them around our scenes. Another really important tip with this is a lot of times when you have the corners between 2 walls, usually these little biomes will start to form on the cracks of the walls, going up the walls and outwards. If you're familiar with ambient occlusion, this sort of starts to mimic it, but it's always better if you can find a real texture. You can see here, as soon as we start to get close to the wall, they start to get this barcode effect on the side, and it's just because our projection is a bit too big. So we could either stretch it in Y, but we could always scale this down in X and just make this really thin. And then if we start to bring this on the ground, we can make it so it just starts to appear on the very edge, and we can line that up. And now that we've set up that correctly, if we duplicate this over here, we can do a negative scale in our Z just to bring that out. We don't want to make it too uniform, but just kind of populating these out. And around here, we could add our other materials in. But now we get a lot on the ground, and we still get this harsh cutoff on the wall itself. So let's make sure to add something on the wall. So we'll rotate this 90 degrees and bring it really, really close to the wall and rotate it 180 degrees in X. And now you can see where those overlap. If we swap this out for another texture and make this a bit smaller, you can see that now we have some nice breakup coming up and down our walls, and we can easily customize these however we want to inside of our scene. Decals are one of those things because we're instancing them and just reusing the same thing over and over again. We've used hundreds of these when building environments for LED walls. You can add as many as you want, and it really won't affect your render times. It's also worth noting, depending on how close we are to the edge, they'll start to fade in and out. So if you're very particular, you turn off your snapping and just really start to dial in exactly where you want these to land. You can just have them start to fade off so they're not full intensity. And the same is true if you rotate them. You could always, let's turn off snapping here. You can always have it where the bottom fades out, but the top is still there. So you can get pretty creative with these and really go to town on an environment. This is pretty basic at this point, but we'll make sure to keep pushing these more and more, and I'll show you some more tricks later on. And then lastly, if you have a couple that you're pretty happy with, you can also just select the whole group of them here. Now we have all of these selected, and you can duplicate things as a group. So I'm going to Alt, click, and drag on Z here. And now we have these clustered, and because we have this perfectly square layout, we can drag these across, and we could still rotate these around, do whatever we want with them as a group, and they'll all stay together as long as they're selected. Cool, and now we have some pretty interesting breakups across our wall there. Let's just toggle the before and after to see how big of a difference that makes. And that's nice, and really starts to break up any sort of tiling that we might have seen beforehand. And just to start blocking out this scene, we don't have to get too fancy. Let's just turn our angle snapping back on so we can rotate this 180 degrees. And then we'll align this to the other side here. Now if we pop into unlit mode, we'll still see that these have the same amount of effect. We can see that it's actually changing the albedo color, or if we change the roughness or the normal intensity, it'll also change in our viewport. Let's add a concrete crack decal, and let's see how decals can affect the normals of our objects. So we have these asphalt cracks here, and if you just look at the icon, you can see that it does look like there's some depth to these. So let's add one of these to our scene, and let's see what it looks like on the ground. So if I drag these on here, they're pretty thick by default, but if we get up close, you can see that they do seem to make a bit of a difference, especially, again, when looking at the sun. But if you open up the material instance here, let's just crank the normals. Sometimes you do have to be a bit more intense on the normal intensity for decals just to make sure that they show up. And you can see if we crank this anywhere between 2 and 4, it becomes really obvious that they're showing up, but it does start to look fairly dark. So one thing we can also do, if we swap to unlit mode, we can see, okay, yeah, it honestly looks like it's a completely different concrete material versus just cracks existing in the same material. So now that we're in unlit mode, now for some reason, the decal master material is set up differently than our regular surface materials. And one thing that is pretty odd to me in this setup is that they change out the color tint and the nice color settings we had before into a color overlay. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this, but we'll get into modifying these more later. But if I just make this brighter, all these values also go higher than 1. So I can even set this to 1.25. And if you look here, it's subtle, but we're a little bit green and a little bit yellow. So because we know if we're too green and too yellow, we can start to drag our color in the opposite direction. So here it's obviously more green, but if we start to drag it into this bluer realm, it'll start to tie in closer to our concrete. Now if I talk back to the lit settings, now if I look at the concrete crack, it does start to look like it's indenting the concrete floor instead of being this dark outline that we had originally. So a lot of times, if I'm trying to balance the colors of any of these Quixel assets or the assets in your scene, it's a really good idea to do that in unlit mode. Make sure everything looks like it's correct on the surface, because it's a bit hard to tell exactly what that color is when you have different colored lights in your scene, like the sunlight or any other point lights. Cool, so now we'll just click and drag these and duplicate a couple across our scene just to break up the ground. And again, if we use that fading setting, if we just lift this out of the ground, we can see the further we get, at a certain point, it'll start to fade out. And based on how much it's faded, it will also fade our normal intensity. So if we just start to lift this up, we'll see that we get a lot more detail out of this crack. It has less depth, and it's not quite as black, which in this case can look a little bit more believable and integrated versus some of the dark lines that we're getting from our really intense cracks. In fact, I'm just going to lift those up and just help them integrate a little bit more. Now, one more thing we can do is we could add puddles of water that reflect. We can make them really glossy or set them to 0 roughness, so they're very, very reflective, just like water. But if you type in puddle and we select decals, We're not going to get any water puddles, but instead of searching for puddles, it's going to be weird at first, but just trust me, if you search for blood, they have these blood stains decals, which I guess are graphic content now. That's new in Unreal 5.1. And we'll just try to look for some very large puddles. So let's just grab these two. And again, just make sure these are at medium quality so that our texture memory is still fairly low now that we're starting to add more and more things into our scene. So we'll export our blood materials and close out Quixel Bridge. And now let's open up our material here. So I'm going to set this to a plane. And now decals are a bit awkward to preview in the editor because if you see them over the sky, they don't really show up because they need to be over a opaque surface to show up correctly. So a lot of times I'll just set it to a cube, and you can see if we get up close to the top here, they do have some nice shininess, but one thing is clear that it is definitely red and not neutral colored or maybe blue or green like you'd expect a murky puddle to be. So briefly, we could take our color overlay and we can just take all of the red out and set our red to 0. All right, so now let's drag what is now our water material into our scene. And one thing that you can do, especially on characters, a lot of times you'll want decals on the floor, but if something's moving through the scene, it's really hard to line up every decal where it doesn't affect another surface. So one thing that we can do on any actor is in our details panel here, you can just search for decal, and there's this receives decal option, and we can just uncheck that. And now no matter where we drag this decal or any other decal in our scene, it won't be affected. And now you can see that we can put this under our actor as well, and we can get a really nice reflection from our new water decal. And again, depending on how far away we place this, we can change the opacity of our decal, which will also change how reflective it is. Cool. And one last note, there's another setting here called sort order. So if you ever have something like this, you would expect that the water would go on top of our crack decal. So if we just change the sort order to 1, whatever decal has the highest sort order will be placed on top. So if we change this to -1 or 0 like it was, it will go underneath. By default, everything is set to 0. So most of the time, if you have something, set it to 1, but you could set this to 1,000 or any number that you want. So let's do the same thing to our other blood splatter. We'll just change the color overlay here and change the red channel to 0. And it'll give us this blue-green tint, which will kind of work for what we're doing. And now we can start to instance these around our scene. Cool. Now this will just get us started. Again, we're just trying to block it out and see how all of these things work together. But now we have some pretty nice integrated decals across our scene. Hopefully we're starting to understand how materials and material instances work and how we can modify them. But for now, I want to briefly talk about blueprints.